Okay. So c'est en anglais. Si je parle trop vite, just stop me. You can ask questions, you can interrupt. L'interruption, c'est bon. Okay. Nietzsche's lectures at the University of Basel on the pre-Platonic philosophers, offered in the summer sessions of 1872, 1873, and 1876, are notable, amongst other things, for their correlation of pre-Platonic physics, or rather the natural philosophy of Greek antiquity, with the physics and chemistry of Nietzsche's day. That is, for their correlation of ancient and modern Sophia and Scientia. But the ancient physiologoi, the ancient natural philosophers, physiologue, Greek physiologoi, are not taken in these lectures as precursors or forerunners to modern physics. They are read instead as fellow researchers, fellow investigators, as colleagues, if you will. And Nietzsche the physician, Nietzsche the latter-day physiologon, gives three of the pre-Platonics or pre-Platonic physiologoi pride of place in his lectures: Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and Socrates. These three, he states, are the purest paradigms of what he called philosophical types. Plato and later philosophers after him being mix and match versions of these archetypes. Nietzsche devotes his longest and most intensive lectures to Pythagoras, the Pythagoreans, and to Heraclitus. Indeed, his own future philosophy emerges from between these two pre-Platonic pillars. Boy, there's going to be a lot of P's in here. Socrates, the third, Socrates, like Pythagoras, but without the latter's religious overtones, oaths, and rituals, stands as an exemplar of philosophical life, of a life lived philosophically to its end. His life was steered not by self-interest, the accusation Heraclitus had lodged against Pythagoras, but by the philosophical kybernetes, as in Heraclitus' 41st fragment. Unlike Socrates, Heraclitus withdrew from society, and in a sense, the two Nietzschean pillars, Heraclitus on the one hand and Pythagoras on the other, were inversions one of the other. Heraclitus refusing and withdrawing from political office, his role as Ephesian Basileus, and Pythagoras taking up precisely this role at Crotona. Pythagoras' interest in politics, leadership, and good government gained him harsh Heraclitean criticism, the latter famously stating in one of his fragments, fragment 129, I refer to the Deals numbering, that although he had pursued inquiry further than all other men, Pythagoras was too picky, too particular. By choosing what he liked from his data, he made a wisdom of his own, instead of hearkening to the one and only physiologos, the one and only logos. The one and only logos, which Heraclitus at times called phusis, at times polemos, and at times a flickering flame, pyros, was the same for all, this is fragment 2, and yet ever-changing, always at odds with itself. The same for all, and yet never self-same. That which never itself stays the same. No god or man made this logos, that's fragment 30. It is not a private creation or possession, fragment 2. And yet most men live as though they had their own logos, their own logic, their own words, their own world. According to Heraclitus, this was also the case with Pythagoras. Pythagoras, he admitted, was polymathein, a very learned man, but nevertheless kakotechnian, a man of bad technique. All of Pythagoras' artful methods via his sephoi, or in Latin calx, from which we get the idea of calculation, all his calculations, his counting stones, via his sephoi, via his geometrical proofs, via his own via philosophia, his aesthetic praxis, all of these were for Heraclitus metahodoi, metahodologies, gestures away from, aside from, beside, beyond, meta, the true path, the veritable course, the hodos philosophos. The physiologon, the one who would pursue the physiologos, and the philosophos, philosopher as such, must avoid, this is Heraclitus, must avoid the imposition of technique, of technical know-how, of know-how in general, impositions which are, with respect to the logos at hand, impostors, foreign and alien to the veritable matrix or mathesis, which is ever-flowing, ever-changing, and ever in need of reconsideration and recalculation, a perpetual education in the sense of edicere, being conducted elsewhere, the Latin translation of the Greek word mathesis. Heraclitus called Pythagoras the prince of impostors, this is fragment 81, because of his impositions, his kakotechnion, his bad techniques, which masked the here and now with prior and post determinations, not to mention personal predilections. The logos, again, is not a private creation or possession, and although it is the fount, pagan, and root, rhizoma, of persons and possessions, it is also utterly, or rather unutterably, impersonal, impossible to capture and confine at a personal, individual level, always flowing forth from them, flowing forth from such ordinations into the greater coordinate context qua matrix. The logos is not only the matrix or mathesis of Pythagoras, the latter's tetrad or tetractys of 1, 2, 3, and 4, which add up to 10 and make up the tenfold triangle, which is the entire decimal system for him. It is not only that, but also the system, matrix, or mathesis's circuits, feedback loops, and inner interrelations, which Pythagoras, via his disciple Hippasus, discovered to be downright incalculable. An alogos in Greece, or surd in Latin, which is soul en français, unspoken, unspeakable, unheeded, and unheard en anglais. The logos is thus a logos alogos. It speaks the unspeakable, the unheeded, and the unheard, the ultimately incalculable and absurd. This is Heraclitus' logos. Aristotle, in the Metaphysics, reminds us that Hippasus, the Pythagorean, was said to have taught Heraclitus, and to have divulged in so doing this terrible secret, that of the incalculable with and in all things calculable. The Byzantine Suda also attests to this interconnection, namely the ancient tradition which states that Heraclitus had been a pupil of the Pythagorean philosopher Hippasus of Metapontum, who, like Heraclitus, believed the universe to be in a state of incessant change and that it consists of fire as its prime element, in this case paraphrasing a gloss by Wheelwright. In any case, Hippasus and Heraclitus were what we might call post-Pythagorean pre-Platonics, and the polemical interconnection of Pythagoras and Heraclitus via Hippasus was of incalculable importance for the formation of Nietzsche's own philosophical thought, as Nandita actually pointed out before. In light of these connections, Nietzsche's presentation of Pythagoras and Heraclitus as the two pillars, and along with Socrates, the three purest paradigms of ancient and modern philosophy, the pursuit of Sophia and Scientia, might perhaps now appear less bizarre. The reason he called his lectures on pre-Platonic rather than pre-Socratic philosophers was in order to underscore the paradigm shift and the break with physiological exploration, the break with the physiologos as such, which Plato and philosophy after Plato presents. The logos from Plato onward was not a logos alogos, but a logos supposedly expressed, at least in part, in and through its many different manifestations. Each manifestation, each phenomenon, was a pale imitation and thus a reflection of the Platonic logos. Charting the line of the imitatio logos would lead us, through such dialogoi, to the whole truth that these partial truths each endeavor in their own way to express. According to Plato, then, the logos is or can be expressed. According to Heraclitus and Hippasus, however, the logos, always a logos alogos, far from being expressed, is, in the spirit of tragic philosophy, always instead suppressed, trampled upon underfoot, crushed like the earthworm of Bataille's infâme. What it designates, here quoting Bataille en anglais, total perversion, has no rights in any sense and gets itself squashed everywhere, like a spider or an earthworm. For academic men to be happy, it seems that the universe would have to take shape. On the other hand, affirming that the universe resembles nothing and is only formless amounts to saying that the universe is something like a spider or spit. Très Georges Bataille. Or here, in this lecture, that the universe is like a pre-Platonic logos a logos. Following Nietzsche, Gilles Deleuze referred to the pre-Platonic logos a logos, or which we can also understand as the phusio logos, as a veritable anti-logos when compared to the logos of Aristocles Plato and of philosophy's logocentric tradition afterward. This in an interview with Arnaud Villani. Has the anti-logos returned despite Plato? Villani therefore asked Deleuze. According to Deleuze, it has not. The logos a logos or physiological anti-logos, still remains buried in philosophy's graveyard, backyard, or background, as a rhizome that runs underground. Relating it to the physiology, the involuntary or will-less physics of Proust's Mémoires involontaires, rather than to, quote, the tricks of the sophists, unquote, he, Deleuze, suggests that the physiologos, logos or anti-logos, remains, as Heraclitus himself had said, encrypted, covered over in the compost heap of perceptual and conceptual history. Physes crypteste philei. I can't speak Greek, so that's the best you get. That wrote Heraclitus. Nature loves to hide. Fragment 123. Its discovery, as the Paracelsian alchemical philosopher Gerhard Dorn once said, and Walter Benjamin out long after him, is a matter of digging into the refuse of history, of getting into the gutter, of trudging through the trash, of facing what has been effaced, abandoned, and objected. Physes cryptestae philei suggests that the physiologos, logos, or anti-logos has always been abandonment, meant for the refuse bin, garbage can, and compost heap, as much in philosophical antiquity as it is and always was in philosophical modernity. Seekers of gold dig up much earth and find little, wrote Heraclitus in Fragment 22. Seek not the gold as goal, then, but rather, as Nietzsche said, the sense of the earth. And this is Nietzsche. Under such flattering colors, makeup, and jewelry of human vanity, the basic text of Homo Natura must again be recognized. He wrote this in the preface to his Zarathustra. To translate man back into nature, into physis, into the physiologos, is the task of the modern philosopher, the philosopher who endeavors to articulate der Sinn der Erde, the sense of the earth, the ground of being. This earth or ground, like the ever-flowing nature of the Pythagoreans or the ever-burning fire of Heraclitus and Hippasus, this earth or ground as the ever-flowing nature of the Pythagoreans and the ever-burning fire of Heraclitus and Hippasus, is ever-changing, ever-rearranging, ever-transmuting or transmogrifying. It is in a state of incessant becoming, and becoming is its mode of being. Stable structures are, with respect to this ground, metastable facades, metastable facets of an otherwise ongoing ontogenesis. Stable structures are prostheses with respect to this thesis, this perpetual placing and replacing. And this includes ourselves, our very sense of self, which is not of the earth, but off it. The self is a prosthesis, an appendage, a technologon, technologically articulating facets, facades of a more fundamental and fundamentally constitutive compost, an earthly aggregate or pre-prosthetic field. This is why Heraclitus begins his inquiry not, as René Descartes does, with the self, or in Heraclitus' case, the ancient Greek hupokimenon, but rather with a search for the self. I searched for myself, he wrote in Fragment 101. In other words, his path, the hodos philosophos, began prior to his individuality, in the midst and midden, the garbage and or compost heap, of his individuation, his process of self-creation and of auto and ontogenesis. An individual self, according to the Pythagoreans, is also understood as a metastabled aspect, facade, or facet. The individual manifestation of an ongoing metempsychosis, a series of possible, actually partial solutions to a cryptic, encrypted question, what Alfred Jarry would have called a profound pataphysical question or problem. Selves concress only to dissolve and then resolve again. Their stability is always illusory, imaginary, an imaginary solution or solution via image resolution to a prior pre-individual problematical and paradoxical fount, pagan, and root, rhizoma, a tangled web of interconnections analogous or harmonious to the logos of Heraclitus and to the tetractys or triangular flame of the Pythagoreans, the pyramid or pyre of every numero-connotational permutation. This puts Pythagorean and Heraclitean natural philosophy in the neighborhood not only of Nietzschean genealogy, but also the environmental mechanology of Simondonian theorists today. Mechanology could here be understood as the logos or logi of the ancient Greek mekhos, or Proto-Indo-European maghana, pre-Platonic words for power in the sense of capacity, capability, ability, and the force that enables. from the base root mag, out of which come English words like mighty and German words like the Macht of Nietzsche's Wille zur Macht, the Nietzschean élan vital. Mechanology, in a sense, understands logos, in the sense of physiologos, as Wille zur Macht, the propulsive force or élan vital of existent things. It is the force that gives rise, phuseo, to things, the force of individuation. And in mechanological analyses, although things, individual subjects and objects, play a part, they do not play a central part, nor even a teleological one. The thing itself is not the goal, precisely because, mechanologically, following the mechos of the physiologos, a thing is never by itself, and what's more, is never itself. A thing, an individual subject or object, individualizes itself transductively. It is, in other words, a transduction. To translate man back into nature, physiological translation, translates man, human being generally and in particular, as transduction. Transduction is in some sense a composting, posting at once two different features or multiple aspects in a manifold manner. In the first English study wholeheartedly devoted to Simondonian theory, a study entitled Transductions, the Scotsman Adrian Mackenzie, now at Lancaster in the UK, explained the process of transduction as follows. For the process of transduction to occur, there must be some disparity, discontinuity, or mismatch within a domain. Transduction is the process whereby a disparity or difference is topologically and temporally restructured, one might say modulated. It is the mediation of different organizations of energy. Régis Debray uses the term mediology instead of mechanology to describe transductive philosophy, understanding transduction as a mediation pure and simple, however complex it may be. Heraclitus has had his own word for the medium message, or McLuhan-esque medium is the message mediation of transduction, the Greek word synapsis. Miroslav Markovich translates Heraclitean synapsis as connection, and translates the synapsis fragment 10, as follows. Quote, connections, things whole and things not whole, something which is being brought together and something which is being brought apart, something which is in tune and something which is out of tune. Out of everything that can be made a unity, and out of this unity all things are made, unquote. Such connection or transduction is synonymous, according to Heraclitus, with the physiologos itself. And the connection of connection or transduction and the logos, connection as the logos, led Martin Heidegger to define the Heraclitean logos as a gathering together of that which lies disparate. A gathering together that nevertheless lets that which lies disparate lie before us in its disparity. Something I would say, transduction. Moving from Martin Heidegger's study of early Greek thinking to Muriel Combes' study of the individual and the collective according to Simondon, quote, we will call transduction this mode of unity of being through its diverse phases, its multiple individuations, unquote. We are coherent individuals for all of our incoherence by way of transductively. Transduction conserves and integrates the opposed and, for Nietzsche, antagonistic aspects of every existent thing. Everything in its existence. In his study of transduction, Mackenzie makes an astute interconnection between transductive interrelation, transductive mediation, and the physiological insights of Michel Serres, who, in an interview with Bruno Latour, articulated his philosophy of communication, his philosophy of Hermès thought, in terms of, quote-unquote, enfolded time. To think transduction and to think transductively, quote, our first step is to look for the folding of time, unquote. Mackenzie then continues, quote, folding replaces separation in such a perspective. Transductive mediation brings together elements that are not strictly contemporary or simultaneous in terms of their geneses. As an assemblage or multiplicity, a transductive mediation assembles heterogeneous elements from different times, from the Paleolithic to the contemporary. Consider a late model car, for example, an example provided by Michel Serres. It is a disparate aggregate of scientific and technical solutions dating from different periods. One can date it component by component, This part was invented at the turn of the century, another 10 years ago, and Carnot's cycle is almost 200 years old, unquote. From one perspective, Mackenzie admits, this appears to be a trivial point, a trivial machine. Quote, of course the elements of an ensemble have differently dated origins. The thermonuclear bomb, for instance, still involves technical elements such as bolts and screws. The invention of a bolt lies hundreds of years back in date from the vector processor of the supercomputer, which handles the floating point calculations needed to model what will happen to the bolt after detonation. In that sense, there are clearly no present-day artifacts, only mixtures which associate elements inherited from different times, unquote. However, the argument is more complicated than this, Mackenzie explains. Rather than unilinear progress from past to future, time flows in a turbulent and chaotic manner, as Seyle pointed out to Latour. Because this mixing of technical elements introduces detours or transverse connections, Heraclitean connections, in both the many, i.e. a given collectivity, and every manifold individuality, i.e. given individual objects or subjects. The many and or manifold enfold networks of relation which mediology, mechanology, connective, or we could say post-modern consideration brings to light. The transduction of these networks function like the pilot principle of which Heraclitus and later and after him Socrates in the Republican statesman spoke. Kybernetic transductions permit these networks of relations to vary their topology without always falling apart. As Mackenzie again explains, quote, when an alternate path between 2 points opens, the actors or nodes, the manifold or many, within the network are exposed to alternate rhythms of contact. As 2 points in a network, previously separated by a certain distance or delay, become more closely linked, time within the collective folds in some way. Depending on the scale of the detour, the mesh of relations composing the collective manifold becomes augmented and distorted. When a different mediation enters the mesh of relations, different cycles and repetitions start up. Thus time, the very form of the irreversible redundancy according to Seyle, is folded differently. These rhythms, produced by synchronizations and delays, involve repetitions, cycles, and feedback loops working against, with, through, or independent of other repetitions, cycles, and beats. Unquote. A mere few days ago, I was working in our garden back in Canada, pulling weeds and digging out an especially aggressive and expansive one, Japanese knotweed. Japanese knotweed is a rapidly spreading rhizome, each tubular part or segment of which has raised joints or nodes out of which arborescent bamboo tree-like extrusions can develop whenever the conditions are right, and pretty well always right. Its tubers, and therefore its bamboo tree-like extrusions, can grow in almost any kind of soil, from the most arid and inhospitable to the richest composted topsoil. They can also cut through wood, brick, cement, and of course other plants in a rather monological, non-dialectical manner. That said, it does tend toward paths of least resistance, at least at first, working around obstacles via detours and often turning along them, following the folds of the obstacle itself and becoming in some sense the obstacle's analog. This was the seed, or rather the tuber, that gave rise to in the compost of a few days' composition to the present paper, this presentation, and its reflections on non-dialectical transduction. It brings me back to the logos prior to Plato, and to the terrain and terrible logic of Hippasus and Heraclitus. Reading the weeds, weeding and writing, and in some sense becoming weed myself, following their hodos, their network pathways, it dawned upon me, like the sun always knew, that my struggle with them, the polemos, was in no way an alternate logos. We were joined with and in a singular network. Every slice into it, every tranche, chaque tranche, each section I dug up, uprooted, removed, being this network's further realization and reticulation. There was no outside of this text, no all text or all odos, only an infinitely enfolding and unfolding network, a monstrous Hypasio-Heraclitean mathesis, akin to the third dialogos that was the great secret and great terror of the Pythagoreans, the uncalculable matrix of the universal mathesis. The end. I didn't win my battle with weeds. They won. And it was a total tragedy. But I learned a lot.
Merci beaucoup. C'était un peu vite quand même. Voilà, c'était très riche. Je n'ai pas tout saisi. C'est trop vite pour moi. Avant de laisser la parole à ceux qui veulent poser une question, j'avais envie de vous demander est-ce que vous faites un lien, et quel type de lien entre le fragment que vous citiez d'Héraclite tout à l'heure, Physis testai philei, et le fragment 93 où Héraclite dit, je ne l'ai pas en grec sous les yeux, je l'ai mis en français, tel qu'on le traduit, moi je vais restituer comme ça, l'oracle qui est à Delphes ne parle pas ni ne cède. Il fait signe. Puisqu'il y a dans les deux fragments la question de se cacher. La physis
Se cache.
se remet. Se crypte. C'est pas exactement la même chose. Et l'oracle qui est à Delphes, voilà, ni ne se retire, ni il fait signe, voilà.
Oui, il fait signe.
J'avais envie de vous demander de parler un petit peu de cela. Moi-même, dans le séminaire, j'avais soutenu une hypothèse sur ce qui sépare les pré-platoniciens. Là-dessus, je suis totalement. Je crois moi aussi qu'il n'y a pas de pré-socratique, il y a des pré-platoniques. Entre les pré-platoniciens et Platon et le platonisme, je pense, j'ai soutenu l'idée qu'on passait dans cette question de transduction des mains, on passait dans la société pré-platonique à un mode d'explicitation des relations. D'une explicitation qui toujours, et c'est pour ça qu'elle est tragique, en ce sens-là, se réimplicite, c'est-à-dire redevient implicite. Et c'est comme ça que j'entends aussi bien le fragment, je ne sais plus quel numéro, la physique à se cacher, que le fragment 93, même s'ils ne disent pas les mêmes. Je pense que c'est le même enjeu, c'est la question de l'implicite. Et que la dialectique, au sens où la dialectique platonicienne, vous n'étiez pas là hier, mais on a essayé de distinguer, je crois que c'était d'ailleurs avec Ricardo, non, c'était pas avec Ricardo, je ne me souviens plus, il y a le dialogos, il y a le dialogue, on a commencé le dialogisme avec Axel, on a posé le problème du dialogisme de Martine, qui n'est pas une dialectique, mais qui par contre est une pratique de Socrate. Je crois, et c'est ce que dit Martine et c'est ce que disait Axel. Il y a la dialectique au sens platonicien, et il y a plusieurs dialectiques platoniciennes à mon avis. Il y a plusieurs époques de la dialectique chez Platon. Et puis il y a la dialectique au sens kantien, au sens hegelien, etc. etc. Parce que tout ça, ce sont des choses bien différentes. Je crois, ce que je soutenais dans le séminaire, c'était que la dialectique, non plus le dialogisme de Socrate, parce que pour moi Socrate fait partie des tragiques, mais la dialectique de Platon, qui ne fait plus partie des tragiques, faisait passer l'explicitation qui se réimplicite toujours à l'explication qui veut se débarrasser de l'implicite, c'est-à-dire qui veut éliminer purement et simplement l'implicite, on pourrait presque dire le pré-individuel, c'est-à-dire un pré-individuel qui n'est pas... Ça, c'était la première chose que je voulais vous dire, et je me demandais si vous aviez quelque chose à dire là-dessus. Et l'autre chose, c'était par rapport à Simondon, les Grecs, les présocratiques, on les appelle les Nietzsche. Parce que, voilà, vous faites une revisitation simondonienne de tout ça. Mais qu'est-ce que Simondon dit, lui, des présocratiques? Est-ce qu'il leur dit quelque chose? Est-ce qu'il dit quelque chose de Nietzsche? Moi, je ne sais pas, je ne suis pas... Oui.
Individuation psychique et collective, c'est une chapitre dans
l'histoire de la notion d'individu,
oui.
Il y a une vingtaine de pages sur les présocratiques, la influence d'Anaximandre pour la Péronne, la question de la folie, sa conception.
Oui.
Oui, les présocratiques pour la pensée de Simondon sont décisifs. Sont à la fois les plus grands anticipateurs de sa propre pensée. Il y a trouvé des concepts cardinaux de sa philosophie, qui sont la Péronne, l'illimité, qui lui vient d'Anaximandre. J'ai même une hypothèse, c'est que sa pensée intégrale de la vie et de la mort et de la succession des individuations, de l'irréversible qui part du pré-individuel pour y revenir, on trouve ça dans Mellamphy, eh bien, serait tout simplement une réinterprétation de la succession des mondes chez Anaximandre. Bon, ça c'est ma propre hypothèse. Ensuite, en ce qui concerne la physis, on le retrouve chez tous les présocratiques, c'est bien sûr un concept cardinal, mais il y a d'autres aspects également qui sont très importants, c'est qu'il dit les anciens et les présocratiques, pour autant qu'ils pouvaient nous donner une annonce de ce que c'est que la transduction, l'individuation, la question de la pensée, de l'élément, qui est très importante pour lui. Cependant, il leur manquait quelque chose de fondamental pour penser l'individuation et la transduction, c'est la métastabilité. Il dit les anciens ne connaissaient que l'alternative entre stabilité et instabilité.
J'aurais pu le faire pour Thierry, je posais la question.
C'est bon, oui.
Laisse-le répondre après ça.
Okay, Eric, can I speak in English? Is that okay? So Heraclitus has this notion of constant flux, but there are let's say concretions. So there are selves, there are individuals, there are individual things, but you can read them in a Simondonian way as these temporary resolutions that will always be are always being negotiated, dissolved and resolved again and again. So there's a sort of there's a kind of there are inclinations toward metastability, these notions, but of course they're not at all developed. And in fact, a lot of it is, of course, reading back onto. Right? We're forcing a reading onto the pre-Socratics. But you can see a lot of it's very, let's say, sympathetic to a Simondonian philosophy, a worldview. That said, one of the things that I fear when I read Heraclitus, for example, I have the Thomazine, the fear that starts the philosophical quest, is this his insistence that with respect to the logos as he doesn't, it's inconceivable, but as he understands it or tries to understand it, it is there is no dialogue. That idea is you cannot dialogue. Any dialogue is a movement away from the logos. So this logos becomes a monstrous thing, an all-encompassing network from which there is no escape, and within which there is no actual conversation. There's only a kind of versage without conversage. Version, yeah, diversion. There are, you're being diverted from it constantly, and so the philosopher's task, absurdum, totally absurd task, is to try not to be diverted, or try to redivert the path that will always inevitably be diverted again. It's a very difficult task and a sort of an absurd one. But my problem with Heraclitus, and my problem in the middle of weeding a garden that is being overrun completely with weeds, is that there's no room for dialogue.
Yes, mais moi je pense que peut-être que nos amis nombreux Simondoniens ne seront pas les plus d'accord avec ça. Je pense que dans Simondon il y a du pardon. Je disais que je pense que dans Simondon il y a du dialogue. La question n'est pas tellement de s'attacher au mot de dialogue, il y a du diachronique dans le synchronique, et je pense que la métastabilité, moi je crois aussi qu'il y a quelque chose de la métastabilité chez les présocratiques, et que c'est pas si net, c'est à propos de la philosophie moderne, des modernes, des physiciens modernes, c'est pas à propos des présocratiques. Mais je pense qu'il y a chez Simondon, en creux en tout cas, la question disons, moi j'appelle ça la co-individuation, c'est pas un terme de Simondon, mais je pense qu'il ne veut pas y avoir de passage de l'individuation psychique à l'individuation collective comme un processus qui produit du transindividuel, indépendamment de... Alors, après la question c'est est-ce qu'on privilégie la structure du langage ou pas? Ça c'est une autre question. Quand on pose que la dialectique se fait dans le champ du langage, par exemple, logocentrisme de Socrate, pas de Platon, etc., ou qu'on dit au contraire, mais le logos d'Héraclite, par exemple, c'est un logos des choses, c'est un logos ce sont des rapports, voilà, c'est une question de rapport. Et ça, et chez tous les présocratiques, c'est comme ça. Le logos, c'est une affaire de rapport. Je dirais que ça, c'est pas la question. Parce qu'il peut y avoir, on peut dire qu'il y a du dialogue entre les choses, à la limite.
Oui.
Ce que vous citiez la tour. Mais à partir du moment où il y a des processus qui sont via y compris les choses, parce que les choses, eh bien c'est le sujet dont on parlait tout à l'heure avec Christian, à propos de Digital Humanities, il disait que c'est très intéressant de se demander qu'est-ce que c'est qu'écrire pour une machine. Alors ça c'est pas un dialogue entre les choses, mais c'est un dialogue entre moi et une chose, bon, un dialogue entre guillemets. Mais en tout cas c'est une transduction entre moi et la chose. Si on conçoit un certain type de relation transductive, je ne dirais pas toutes les relations transductives, mais un certain type de relation transductive, comme un rapport, et ce rapport comme un dialogos au sens héraclitéen, non pas du dialogue, mais au sens où il y a, le logos est un rapport, et que des rapports se constituant, il y a du dia qui se produit, c'est-à-dire du déphasage, dirait Simondon, et donc du temps, et donc de l'individuation. La question n'est pas de faire une fixette sur le platonisme. La question est plutôt de savoir, à mon avis, pourquoi le modèle dialectique a si bien fonctionné dans l'histoire de la philosophie, et pas seulement pour de mauvaises raisons, il y a de mauvaises raisons, mais aussi pour de bonnes raisons. S'il n'avait pas eu de bonnes raisons de fonctionner, il n'aurait pas fonctionné. S'il fonctionne depuis Socrate, et là je parle du dialogique de Socrate, et pas du logocentrisme de Platon, jusqu'à la dialectique transcendantale de Kant, et au-delà, parce que je crois que même la dialectique hegelienne est beaucoup plus importante qu'on ne le croit, à commencer par Simondon lui-même. Alors, la question, il faut distinguer deux questions très différentes, à mon avis. Une qui est celle de, appelons ça, pour prendre des mots galvaudés, la métaphysique, le logocentrisme, etc. Tous ces effets stérilisants, explicatifs, etc. Mais autre chose qui est comment, justement, par exemple, à travers Simondon, on peut interpréter tout ça. Et à mon avis, c'est comme ça que Simondon fait de la philosophie. C'est-à-dire que Simondon revisite Leibniz, il revisite Kant, il revisite Aristote, il revisite Platon, souvent il ne le dit pas d'ailleurs, ça ne se voit pas. Et il reprend absolument, il recycle tout ça. Et il en fait quelque chose de nouveau qui est la pensée de la transduction, etc. Mais je crois que si maintenant on veut faire de Simondon quelque chose qui, par exemple, respectera ce qu'il voulait, c'est-à-dire une philosophie des sciences humaines, parce qu'à un moment donné, il présente son projet comme ça. Alors, il faut reprendre, en tout cas moi j'essaie de faire ça, mais je pense qu'on peut le faire autrement, bien entendu. Il faut reprendre, par exemple, les grandes questions de la linguistique. et essayer de revisiter les théories linguistiques à partir d'un point de vue simondonien, et à partir de là, peut-être interpréter l'histoire.
Il ne fait pas ça, lui.
Non, il ne fait pas.
Mais pour rejoindre votre première question, the fragment on the give sign doesn't hide or reveal, only give sign. Est-ce que c'est la langue là? La langue? Je pense pas.
La langue est un des mois. Le problème, c'est soit on est logocentrique, et à ce moment-là on dit tout le logos c'est la langue. Soit on n'est pas logocentrique, et je crois qu'on dit la langue est un des champs d'expression du logos. Après, pour moi, les questions de transduction, ça passe par la grammatisation. Et si aujourd'hui la langue est si importante dans l'histoire de la philosophie, et la grammaire, à laquelle je pense en disant, j'avais écrit ce machin à l'entrée, en pensant à l'Inde, dont on parlait d'Andita tout à l'heure, où la grammaire est beaucoup plus importante que la géométrie, c'est parce que la vraie question pour moi derrière tout ça, c'est la grammatisation, c'est la transduction, il faut que ça tranche. C'est le couteau. C'est le couteau. Mais il se trouve que le couteau a fonctionné essentiellement dans la langue. Parce que l'écriture a fonctionné, l'écriture a été la grande machine à découper. Parce que c'est Héraclite qui dit ça. Qui dit quoi que ça découpe. C'est une analyse de Clémence Ramnou qui explique que c'est le fragment, je ne le connais pas par cœur, où Héraclite dit il faut penser la séparation des choses avec la séparation des mots. Et Clémence Ramnou dit mais il ne peut dire ça que parce que c'est l'époque, à l'époque d'Héraclite, on commence à séparer les mots, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'écrit plus les mots attachés en grec, on les sépare. Et donc c'est parce qu'il y a cette séparation que... Alors, ce que je veux dire, c'est ça n'est pas parce qu'il faut se débarrasser du logocentrisme qu'il faut foutre la langue par-dessus bord. On continue à travailler dans la langue. Ce qui fait que la langue est la langue, c'est qu'elle est grammatisée. Pour moi, elle devient. Maintenant, j'ai beaucoup commenté à une époque un texte absolument magnifique de comment s'appelle-t-il, Jean Giono. Jean Giono qui raconte dans un livre qui s'appelle Un du Beaumugne, je vous le recommande, c'est un très beau roman de Jean Giono qui se passe dans la Haute-Provence et qui raconte l'histoire d'un type qui a vécu dans un village un village de protestants. Je ne sais pas si vous savez, mais la Provence était un des hauts lieux des guerres de religion en France. Et il y avait donc des villages protestants. Par exemple, le village de Lacoste était catholique, je crois. C'est le village du marquis de Sade. Et en face de Lacoste, il y a Beaulieu qui était protestant. Ou l'inverse, je ne me souviens plus. Je crois que c'est l'inverse. C'est Lacoste qui était protestant et Beaulieu qui était catholique. Et un jour, ce que je vous raconte est une histoire vraie, qu'on m'a raconté à Beaulieu. Un jour, le cantonnier de Beaulieu, le cantonnier c'est celui qui s'occupe de nettoyer les rues dans les villages, était en train de travailler dans une cave de Beaulieu et la cave s'est écroulée. Et il est tombé, il s'est retrouvé au milieu de squelettes. C'était des squelettes de protestants de Lacoste qui avaient été tués à Beaulieu et jetés dans des fosses. Si je raconte cela, c'est parce que dans Un de Beaumugne de Jean Giono, cet homme qui vient de Beaumugne raconte à un autre que dans son village, il y a très longtemps, au XVIIe siècle, à la fin du XVIe siècle, eh bien, les gens ne parlaient pas. Ils ne parlaient pas. Ils ne parlaient pas pour une raison toute bête, c'est qu'il n'y avait plus de langue. On leur avait arraché la langue. C'était des protestants. Mais ils jouaient de l'harmonica. Et dans ce village, ils étaient tous musiciens, c'était tous de très très grands harmonicistes, parce qu'ils s'étaient mis à jouer de l'harmonica pour remplacer la langue. Et ça, c'est très très intéressant quand on réfléchit. Je vous recommande la lecture de ce passage de Giono. Moi, ce qui m'importe là-dedans, c'est que c'est l'instrument. La langue, pour moi, c'est un instrument comme les autres, qui a été survalorisé par l'histoire de la métaphysique. Mais on peut très très bien, avec un marteau, d'ailleurs je parlerai du marteau après-demain, en passant par Nietzsche, on peut très bien, avec un marteau, faire du dialogos, c'est-à-dire non pas de la dialectique platonicienne, mais du dialogisme. du dialogisme, parce que tout ça, c'est une affaire de facticité. Alors, voilà, ce que je voulais dire, c'est que la question, c'est pas tellement la langue. C'est pas tellement que de sortir de la langue. C'est d'élargir la question du dialogos, bien au-delà de la langue. C'est ça que je voulais dire. Pardon, j'ai été un peu laissé.
Pour Héraclite, c'est de d'emmener la dialogos au polemos. Alors, c'est no, instead of just dialogue, it's polylogue, and then you realize that, you know, instead of just phone, it's cacophone. Le bon et le mal, all of it together. It becomes this kind of barrage. As soon as things get hard to handle, a little monstrous, overflow, out of step with themselves, you're approaching. It's out of step with each point you're trying to make. Then you're approaching the logos, according to Heraclitus, which is always slightly. It's always more than you expect, right? It's beyond expectation all the time. But that's also what I think carries on the dialectic. You know, it always overcomes itself. Every point leads to another point. It's over and overcoming again and again. And good dialogue. You're actually your points are always being overcome, I suppose, again and again.
Mais le polylogue, c'est une question de bhakti aussi. Et il faudrait. Bon, c'est dommage que vous n'étiez pas là quand il fallait intervenir. Si personne ne demande la parole, merci à Dame. Merci.